You now have an HTTP request for logging in, and you're validating the credentials that are provided, which is a great start. In this video, we're going to continue on, and we're actually going to allow users to truly log in so they can perform other actions later on, like creating a new task. So in the end of the day, every single express route we define will fall into one of two categories. It'll either be public and accessible to anyone, or it'll sit behind authentication, and you'll have to be correctly authenticated to use it. Now, the only two routes that are going to be public will be the sign up route and the log in route. Everything else, whether it's related to users or tasks, is going to require you to be authenticated. For example, if you're trying to delete a task, I need you to be authenticated so I can make sure that you are the one to create it. I don't want you to be able to delete a task created by some other user. What we need to do is set up the login request to send back an authentication token. This is something that the requester will be able to use later on with other requests where they need to be authenticated. So I could log in with my account, I'd get the token back, then I could go off and edit my user profile or do something else like create a new task. So the goal of this video is to figure out how we're going to create and manage those authentication tokens. What we'll be using in this course is what's known as a JSON Web Token, or JWT for short. The JSON Web Token standard is very popular. It can be used for all sorts of things, including authentication, and with JWTs, we'll be able to set up everything we want for our little authentication system. For example, we'll be able to do things like have tokens expire after a certain amount of time, so users can't stay logged in forever. Optionally, we could never expire the token and allow a user to use it indefinitely. So let's go ahead and talk more about JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs, as I'll call them here and there. And to start, we'll explore the library we're going to use, which allows us to work with JWTs in Node.js. Over in the browser, what I'm going to do is Google npm JSON Web Token as one word, and that is the package we're looking for, the JSON Web Token library. This provides us everything we need for creating these authentication tokens and validating them, making sure they are still valid. For example, making sure they haven't expired. This is a super popular package with over 1 million weekly downloads, and we're going to start by integrating it into our application in index.js, much like we did with bcrypt.js. Once we understand how it works, we'll integrate it into the Task Manager app. So down below in the terminal, let's go ahead and get started by installing things. I'll use Control-C to shut down the dev server, and from here, npm I JSON Web Token at the latest version, which is 8.4.0. Let's go ahead and get that installed, and once it's installed, I'm just going to start up the dev server once again, and we'll mess around with it in my function over here. Let's start up the dev server. That's npm run dev, and once we have that in place, I'm going to clear the contents of my function, and I'm going to swap out the old require call with a new one. Right here, let's go ahead and create a new constant called JWT, and we will get its value by requiring the following the JSON Web Token library. Down below, we're going to explore how we can create authentication tokens and how we can validate them, then we'll integrate it into the app. To create a new JSON Web Token, we'll be using the sign method available on JWT, that is jwt.sign. Now, sign does indeed take some arguments, which we'll talk about in a second, and the return value from sign is your new token, in our case, our authentication token. This token will be provided to the client, and then they can use the token later on to perform those privileged operations like creating a task. So right here, let's take a quick moment to create a variable to store the token that sign returns. Now, the sign function itself takes two arguments. The first is an object, and the second is a string. The object contains the data that's going to be embedded in your token. Now, for us, using JWTs for authentication, The only thing we really need to store inside of here is a unique identifier for the user who's being authenticated. In this case, the user's ID works perfectly. So the only property we'll set up on our payload is _ID, and I'll set the value equal to a dummy ID for the moment, though later on it'll be the user's real ID stored in the database. So that is it for the first argument. We could provide other pieces of information if we needed to, but the ID gets the job done for our purposes. Now that second argument, this is a secret. This is going to be used to sign the token, making sure that it hasn't been tampered with or altered in any way. All we need to do for this one is provide a random series of characters. I'll just use a sentence like "this is my new course." Any series of characters will work. So what we get back from sign, that is the token we'll end up giving back to the user who's trying to log in. Let's take a quick moment to log it to the console and see what we get. Right here, I'll be logging the token and then saving the program so our little function reruns. And down below, we have a nice long series of characters. This is our JSON Web Token. Now, the JSON Web Token is actually made up of 3 distinct parts separated by the period. So I have 2 periods, one here and one over here. That means this is the first piece of the JSON Web Token. This is a base 64 encoded JSON string, and this is known as the header. It contains some meta information about what type of token it is. It's a JWT, and the algorithm that was used to generate it. The second piece in between the 2 periods, this is known as the payload or body. This is also a base 64 encoded JSON string, and this contains the data that we provided, which in our case would be the ID from up above. After that last period, to the very end of the JSON Web Token, we have the signature, and this is used to verify the token. Later on, when we verify it, we'll see how that comes into play. So the goal of the JSON Web Token isn't to hide the data that you've provided right here. This is actually publicly viewable to anyone who has the token. They don't need the secret to see that. The whole point of the JWT is to create data, this data, that's verifiable via the signature. So if someone else comes along and tries to change the data right here, they're not going to be able to do so successfully because they won't know what secret was used with the algorithm, so things will fail. To prove this real quick, take a moment to copy that middle value, so whatever you have between those 2 periods, and we're going to head over to the browser, and we're going to go to base64decode.org. Now, there's ways in programming languages where you can get this done, but for this little example, we can just paste it in this box, click decode, and what do we see down below? We see some JSON. We have a JSON object with 2 values. We have the one we provided, _ID, ABC123 being the value. Then we have IAT, which stands for issued at, and this is a timestamp letting you know when the token was created. So this is exactly what's embedded in the part of the JSON Web Token right here. Now that we've seen how we can create a token, let's talk about how we can verify our tokens. So back over in Visual Studio Code, what we're going to do is use that token and actually try to verify it by running another function that the JSON Web Token library provides. This is jwt.verify. Verify takes 2 arguments. The first is the token you're trying to verify, and the second is the secret to use. Now in this case, I need to use the exact same secret that the token was created with. So I will take the string from up above and I will paste it down below. Later on in the course, you'll learn how to break this out into an environment variable, but for now, having the strings in line is perfectly fine. Now, verify is going to return the payload for the token if things went well and the token is valid. Otherwise, it's going to go ahead and throw an error. So right here, const data equals, then down below, I'll just use console.log to dump the data to the terminal. Now, in this case, the verification should work, and down below, that's exactly what's happening. We run verify, and we get our data back. Now let's see what happens if things don't work. If I mess the secret up and put two E's on the end in one case but not in the other, I get a whole bunch of stuff down below in the terminal. The error up above is unhandled promise rejection warning, JSON Web Token error, invalid signature. So this is letting me know that the token couldn't be verified based on the input we provided. The secret needs to be the same for both. Now, one more thing we can do with JSON Web Tokens is expire them after a certain amount of time, which can be a really useful thing. To do this, when we create the token, we provide a third argument, an object, where we can customize it with some options. One option is expires in. Expires in allows you to provide as a string the amount of time you want your token to be valid. So for example, I could type in 7 days as a plain English sentence, or something like 2 weeks or 1 month. In our case, let's go ahead and expire our token after 1 second. Actually, let's go ahead and make it shorter, 0 seconds. So the token is technically never not expired. If I go ahead and actually run the program down below, what are we going to see? We're going to see an error. The JWT has expired since the token is never not expired. Now, if I were to crank that up to a more realistic value like 7 days, things would work as expected because 7 days do not pass between when this code and this code run. It's a fraction of a second. And down below, we can see that things are still working. So here's what we're going to do. We'll use JWT sign to create authentication tokens. Then later on, we'll use JWT.verify to make sure the user is authenticated correctly. Let's go ahead and stop here for this one, and we'll integrate JWTs into the Task Manager app in the next one.